Thank you very much for joining me, Martin. How have you been, boy?
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Let me jump straight in. We'll talk about the book. I enjoyed it quite a lot. It's called the Sorrow and the Loss. Um, you might kick us off. There was two revelations that even created like some media headline from one of the chapters in your book regarding the 1987 Enniskillen bomb. One of them was regarding tampering with the bomb by members of MI5, and the other was to do with both Irish and British security forces scrubbing documents afterwards, which pertain to it in an attempt to cover something up. Could you tell us what you could about them, please?
Well, one of the things really about the Enniskillen bomb, I mean, as we know, John, it was one of the major sort of atrocities of the Troubles. The bomb went off at the cenotaph and killed all those poor people there. Just they were there for a celebration and for a remembrance, right? And the thing about the Enniskillen bomb was people uh, immediately reached the conclusion, okay, that this is an IRA bomb and it was there to kill as many people as possible. Now, when I began looking at the background of this, I discovered that the Irish government had been sitting for years on a whistleblower document. And that whistleblower claimed that he was involved with the intelligence community working in Northern Ireland. He'd also been doing some work in the Irish Republic. But he said really that the bomb had been tampered with by the intelligence community. Now, who he means by that, I would assume he's talking about MI5 Special Branch, because that would be the nexus in Northern Ireland, particularly. And he said that the intention really was to mess with the timing so that we kill as many innocent people as possible. And then, obviously, the driven factor from that would be tougher legislation against the IRA. Now, the other thing too is another bomb was due to go off that day at a place called Tullyhoman, and it sort of didn't go off either, and there was a wire running for a very long distance across the Irish border. We don't know why that bomb didn't explode. Was it defective? Was it the same kind of bomb? Was it built by the same people? Because as you know yourself, studying the Troubles, bomb makers generally leave their own signature on a bomb and the way in which they construct it. Now, the Gardaí lost the firing pack for that other bomb that didn't explode. And we don't know why or what happened to it, whether there may have been fingerprints on it. And as far as the Enniskillen bomb is concerned, well, people assumed immediately that the IRA sort of put it in there. But of course, we know they did. The IRA did put that bomb beside the cenotaph, and it was going to kill a lot of people. The intention of the IRA was to kill as many sort of retired military and present military, because it was a military event in many ways, because it was a remembrance event. But the thing that I discovered later, which was very disturbing for me, and this came from sources that I trusted, was that there's been a scrubbing of files in relation to some of the more, I suppose, controversial episodes in Northern Ireland. And some of the files were scrubbed related to Enniskillen. I mean, people in Enniskillen, the families of victims told me, and they've been saying for decades, why was no one brought to justice? Why didn't we get answers to who killed and why and how they killed our loved ones? No answers were ever forthcoming. In fact, a lot of the files related to Enniskillen were destroyed in a fire in an RUC facility near Enniskillen. So, really, when we look back at that, we're left with a kind of void. If you're talking about the investigative writer looking at it, we're left with a void because we don't know what's in there. We really don't.
Okay, regarding the tampering, do you have any kind of reason to believe either way if it was if the person tampering it was a member of the IRA working for security forces,
Well, you see,
or possibly like someone who just worked for security forces, knowing where the bomb is and coming along and tampering with it?
well, you're asking a question, I think, that in many ways is uh, typical of the investigative work that people have been doing for years on the issue of collusion. In other words, for people who are listening, that's the use of terrorist agents recruited from within the paramilitaries who then work for the state. and they're paid agents. Sometimes they're recruited by the use of blackmail, others with the use of money, inducements of some sort. Now, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows who tampered or that bomb was tampered with. We don't know. The IRA will probably say, well, yeah, it was tampered with because we didn't really mean to kill that many people. Well, that's kind of, that's kind of argument, which I mean, doesn't really hold water, does it? I mean, if you're going to put a bomb to explode where all these people are gathered on a Remembrance Day, you're hardly putting it there so that you're just going to injure them. You're just going to kill a lot of people. It's like Gibraltar. They're going to put a bomb in Gibraltar where there's a military band and families gathered. So, the one thing about Enniskillen that is very important is that we don't know why no one was brought to justice for that bomb and that bomb came over the border from the Republic, and the bomb in Tullyhoman as well, right? I mean, who was involved with all of this? Nobody knows. And I think the people of Enniskillen are very angry. And those are Catholics and Protestants, remember. They're not, they're not just one side of the community that's asking this question. I mean, since the book was published, some people have said to me, look, I mean, we need you to sort of reveal what your sources are. Well, I'm not going to reveal my sources. I never have done in my life. That is not journalism. And the only way that journalists can operate is by having the kind of protections that we have. I don't reveal sources. But the thing is that the authorities can answer a lot of the questions I can't answer. They can say what was in the files, okay, or what is even in the files now, or the Irish government can explain why it sat for years on a document from a whistleblower. And it wasn't just the Irish government. I mean, the British government knew about this because it was shared. Dublin very often shares stuff with London. So the fact that, I mean, this came into Dublin, I'm told it was also shared. So the two governments here can explain to us, right? Because the bombing in Enniskillen has a linkage, doesn't it? Do you agree, John? There's a linkage with the bomb coming over the border from the Irish Republic and the bomb exploding in Northern Ireland and arguments that it was tampered with and a whistleblower. So you put all those things together and you say to yourself, well, people have a lot of genuine questions they need answered.
I was going to say, I think on the back of what was published in your book, a group of family members of the victims, via Kevin Winters' law firm, have I think called for an inquiry. Right? Did you see that?
Yes, I was told that there would be a call for an inquiry, and I can understand it. I think they genuinely have a right to call for an inquiry. I do. And Kevin Winters is a very, very good lawyer. It's a very effective law firm. So I think probably the people who are calling for that inquiry have chosen a very good lawyer to represent them.
You be firmly of the belief that it was Gardaí and British security forces who went about scrubbing records from it after it happened.
Well, let's put it this way. There must be records about who was operating south of the border at that time. I mean, the Gardaí would have known, I mean, who was operating south of the border. They had a fair idea who the guys were within the IRA. And north of the border, they had a very good idea too, because British intelligence had, I mean, severely penetrated the IRA. So let's put it this way. I don't know. I think people reached the conclusion that, well, nobody was brought to justice because some of the people involved in this were agents of the state. And it's not unreasonable to reach that conclusion. I mean, you could reach that conclusion, John, in relation to a lot of episodes. When you look at people like Scappaticci, who was just one of the steak knife operatives within the operation called Steak Knife, I mean, what did they know? What did they know when certain people were abducted and being interrogated and tortured by the IRA about to be shot? But very often what happens, and this is something that your listeners may be interested in, a friend of mine who was a very, very good, very famous cop who worked with me when I was writing The Shankled Butchers, Jimmy Nesbitt, who's now passed on, he told me one day that an informant that he had come into his office, and he was carrying inside his coat an RPG-7 rocket launcher. And Jimmy said, well, what are you doing with that here? Because he brought it into, RUC headquarters. And Jimmy said, take it home. And the guy said, well, what do you want me to do with it? He said, whatever you're told to do with it. Now, I said to Jimmy, well, how could you do that? Because he's going to take that out and he's maybe going to use it to kill a soldier or kill a policeman. He said, but Jimmy explained, the thing about informants is that you have to let them be what they are. I mean, in other words, to be good informants and to be able to provide you with information, they've got to have proper bona fides within the organization, within the IRA. In other words, they've got to be loyal. They've got to do what they're told to actually operate effectively and then be able to provide you with information. Another guy who was connected with MI5 told me that the commander of the markets, who was a pedophile, IRA commander, and that was a guy called Davison, whose MI5 moniker was, or let's say code name, was Agent Ascot. He probably loved that. I mean, it sort of made him feel probably a bit like James Bond. And this was Brendan Davison, and his local nickname was Ruby. And the thing about this MI5 agent, he said, well, Ruby was great. We knew he was a bad boy, but he provided so much information that he saved a lot of people by telling us where bombs were being planted in the center of Belfast. But he was also abusing kids, and he was also involved in murders because he had to do what, and as far as the murders are concerned, he had to act as an IRA operative and as an IRA commander. So he was authorizing violence while at the same time telling MI5 what the IRA was up to. So this is the complex world, that we are talking about, even in relation to Enniskillen. When you go into that world, it is complex, and there are a lot of sort of shadows, and it's very difficult sometimes to separate truth, fact from fiction.
Okay, we'll speak in more detail about it later. But you brought up Steak Knife, who comes into the book via Caroline Morland's execution. You made the interesting assertion there that that Scap wasn't Steak Knife; he was just a Steak Knife of multiple.
Yes, this is what people and many journalists didn't know. They just said, "Oh, Scappaticci's Steak Knife," and so people then started just attaching murders to him as if he'd been guilty of maybe 30 or 40. He wasn't guilty of a lot of the murders that he was. They were attached to him in some of the reports that appeared in the media, but he wasn't involved in the Caroline Morland. He wasn't there at the time that she was abducted. I mean, he was there on other occasions. I mean, he was there when they were investigating the Gibraltar escapade. And Scappaticci was, I mean, probably one of the most formidable and effective agents that the British had within the IRA, but he wasn't the only one. There were many.
He's passed on, but I've heard that it's kind of heavily implicated that John Joe McGee also may have been in a similar position to Scap.
One of the things that I kind of try to separate myself from, and that is rumors, right? And unsubstantiated, theories about people like Scap and others. Once you get into that world, you've got to be very careful. I mean, there's a lot of stuff being thrown around. There's been a lot of internecine warfare of a kind within the paramilitaries. So therefore, both sides, you find that you're being offered information by one group within, let's say, the UVF or the IRA, and offered, conflicting information from another group within the same organization. Because of the stresses and strains these organizations went under. And effectively, a lot of that happened because of the efforts of British intelligence to break them up and to create confusion in their ranks. So I'm always very wary about where I go with a lot of the stuff that I hear that comes at me.
One of the, I guess, kind of one of the obvious questions that the like your assertion regarding the Enniskillen bomb would bring up is whether there's men or people out there who are so ruthless and Machiavellian that they would literally look at the Enniskillen bomb as an opportunity to, instead of killing British military, killing civilians instead, which would be a huge negative for the IRA in terms of their PR and stuff. Do you, just of your own opinion, do you think there's those out there who would look at it like a chess game and look at innocent lives as something that could that should be
I think it was a chess game. It was a very brutal chess game in many ways, on both sides. I mean, you have to sort of suggest, you have to say to yourself, well, look, if you're employing, deadly men for a purpose in your organization, that you're hardly employing them, to be the nice guys to sort of hand out chocolates to people. You're hiring them because they're good at what they do, where that's sort of planting bombs, killing people, whatever. So therefore, there was a kind of, particularly within the intelligence community, there was a view that their job really was to damage the IRA, and there were lots of ways they sought to do that, and some of it too was with lies, disinformation. I mean, you had the Information Policy Unit in the early 1970s, and its business was just to tell people lies, and to feed them to the media, and they fed them to journalists, fed them to me, and they fed them to many other guys that I worked with. So we're talking about a kind of complex world where many things can happen that are unexpected and to some extent morally questionable.
Do you have any personal? Okay, so if you are to believe that Asians within the security forces would be that ruthless, that they would basically edit a bomb in order to take more innocent lives. Do you
Am I saying they would do that? I don't know. I mean, the thing about it is, I can't say that who did it, right? I mean, the bomb was tampered with. What I'm revealing is, and as a writer, that's what I do, is that there was a whistleblower saying this is what happened, and that's what I can report. I'm not a magician. I can't come up with evidence which says, look, that is definitive that actually happened. It has to be considered within the context of everything that happened at the time. And it has to be considered in the context of the fact that nobody's been brought to justice for this. And, there were a lot of opportunities, I would suspect, to find the culprits because there was enough information leaking out of the IRA on both sides of the border at that time.
Do you believe that the security forces had any hand in the Dublin Monaghan bombing? It would be along a similar
Well, let's
level.
put it this. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, coming back to that, there's no doubt there was collusion, and there was also the involvement, very deep involvement, of the security forces. Elements of it. I mean, it's not the security forces. It's certainly elements of it. There are a lot of organizations, John, operating at that time, secret organizations, and I don't think the British government always knew what was being done on its behalf. There was a great deal of freedom of action on the part of groups like the Future or Force Research Unit. A lot of the names changed. I mean, there was the Military Reaction Force, also known as the Military Reconnaissance Force, was killing people. So let's be clear about this, that a lot of these things were happening. I mean, during the Heath period, I mean, Heath was quite happy to sort of say to the army, go and do what you want to do. I mean, you can solve this. So, I mean, and that kind of period in many ways bled into the future of what was the Long War. In other words, Kitson in the early 70s created a kind of strategy that became much more sophisticated as time moved on. I mean, he was recruiting people for his squads, and these were killing squads in the early 70s. And then by the time you get to the late 70s into the early 80s and mid 80s, it's a much more sophisticated operation, employing people on both sides, employing people in the loyalist paramilitaries like Billy Wright, who's going and killing people with information being provided by British military intelligence. So, let's put it this way. There was a lot of stuff going on that, we haven't really fully unpacked yet, as far as I'm concerned.
Let us get into the book itself. Like I mentioned, it's called the Sorrow and the Loss. Really enjoyed it. The fact that each chapter is about like a different person and a different theme. I guess, allowed you as an author to dip into various moments along this 30-year conflict, and through the book you'll get a view into many different times and many different aspects of the conflict. How did the idea of producing a book that focused on the women of the conflict, how did that come to you?
I think part of it, in many ways, I said to someone, I was sitting on a beach in Eastern Europe a couple of years ago, and I said to my wife, I'm going to write sort of the last book on Ireland, and I might write a book about women. And she said, that's a really good idea. It's about time that you focused on women, because I hadn't. I mean, I'd ignored them. I mean, in many ways, I was guilty of ignoring the role of women in society, in a conflict society. These were the women who were behind the barricades, trying to keep their children out of the riots, throwing stones and petrol bombs. the ones dealing with the pain on both sides and the loss. We didn't see it. A lot of them were heavily medicated because that was the only way they were able to deal with the chaos. And some of them were involved, particularly on the Republican side, in the violence. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to do this, and I said, yeah, go ahead, do it. But I didn't realize, just what kind of story I was going to be walking into. I didn't think it was going to be a kind of dirty war story with dealing with collusion and dealing with, double agents and all the rest of it. But then when you get into a conflict, you kind of do that. I mean, I would like people in America to read this because you're right about the book. It's short chapters, a lot of chapters giving different perspectives from different people and dealing with different people who were hurt, different women, girls who were hurt in the conflict. Because Americans see the conflict, but they see it as we've all represented it through the eyes of men and through the men who drove the conflict. None of us really thought about the women at all. We just kind of walked away from that or conveniently ignored the subject. So once I started doing it, I mean, I was shocked, to be perfectly honest. It was very emotionally very trying at times. Looking at the pain, decades later, that some of these women were still suffering and suffering PTSD. And they weren't always easy to deal with. I mean, I'm sure if they listen to this, will understand that, they weren't easy to deal with because they were still dealing with the suffering themselves. They're dealing with memories that, I was kind of resurrecting by talking to them about what had happened all those years ago. So it's being brought back to their minds when probably they wanted to forget about it. But in most respects, the women were very, very generous in offering me their time. I mean, there was one woman, for instance, and I wrote a chapter which I discarded before the book was published, and she was the wife of a major assassin, loyalist, and he was killed at his own home, and she was there with her baby at the time. But she said to me, look, I can't have you publish this chapter about me. She said because I'm suffering PTSD, and I thought she's right. I can't do it. I mean, how can I bring more pain to her life if that's how she feels? Then her story is not going to change anything by me publishing it or by not publishing it. I would love to have published it because she had some very, very interesting things to say about Ireland and the kind of Ireland that she wanted to live in. And this is something that's very interesting. The women on both sides, there was no bitterness about each other. There was no bitterness about the way in which they'd had to live in different parts of the society because of the tribalism. They all wanted several things. One was the truth, if there is such a thing. The other one was, justice, which they may never get. And another one was for people to understand what they went through. Whether it was a mother who lost her daughter who was a young policewoman, she's still living with it. The room was the young girl lived in was kept the way it was when she died. So the thing is, when you sort of find yourself on top of this sort of mountain of hurt and of sorrow, you end up feeling, I felt almost guilty about writing it. Do you understand? I felt guilty about sort of intruding on their grief, and yet I had to do it. I thought, society has to sort of address it. It has to look at it, and it has to address their concerns. And I mean, the governments have to address their concerns by trying to provide them with information, with what they need. I don't know if that's possible, John. I don't know.
Straight off the bat, when I do think about like the women of the Troubles, the first kind of instant reaction is always for the mothers. I always feel a great deal of like sympathy and empathy with any women who had kids at the time, even if they weren't involved in any paramilitary activities, none like that. But just the fact that like when you're sitting at home listening to the radio and you hear that a bomb went off in place X, and your kids might have been near it, that jolt and whatever that chemical combination in the brain of like stress hormones and all that, the amount of times that the women of the six counties and surrounding it, the amount of times that they had to feel that kind of adrenaline, kind of like adrenaline and worry shot that you get from it is unreal. It most certainly you touch on it, but most certainly contributes to the I think the level of like prescription drugs and kind of self-medicating that can go on up there as a result of it.
Well, we can't imagine what it's like for a mother whose son disappears. And we know now, of course, that he was secretly buried by the IRA. And until her death, she's waiting for him to come home. And every Christmas, she's buying him gifts and she's putting them in the wardrobe in his bedroom. Can you imagine that? That mother for, and she assumes that he's still alive. He's going to come home. I knew he was dead. I probably should have told her. Because I was the first person to reveal that the IRA was secretly burying people. And I named him in the Dirty War, but the family didn't let her know because they weren't sure that any journalist writing this kind of stuff it should be believed. I mean, that was the kind of reaction at the time. And
Are
so
we talking about Columba McPhee?
yeah, this is Columba, and I sometimes I look his photograph, the photograph that his mother always had of him on the mantelpiece. He just looks like this innocent young guy, and he was, of course, because he was exploited by British military intelligence, and then really sacrificed because the IRA. I mean, knew immediately what he was up to. But he's in Dublin. I mean, and suddenly he disappears one night after going out for cigarettes, and he's never seen again, and they've never found his body. But you have another example where the family who suffered in Keynes from the loss of a father in the McGurk's bar bombing, that his wife for years, John, she believed that he was coming home because he never came home the night that he was blown up. And they didn't release his body for weeks for some stupid reason, but I don't know. But it was just a cruel thing to do because he wasn't involved in the bombing at all. And so she always kept saying to the family, no, he's coming home, and she ended up, with so many seriously, mental issues that it was hard for her to cope and to cope with her children. I mean, the children are going to school every day. They're walking past the bomb site where their father was buried, right, under the rubble. And then one of the boys is painting sort of and drawing coffins with dead bodies in it. Another's, spraying his waist over his bedroom wall. And a girl, one of the children goes to school and she can't spell father. And the teacher said, well, why can't you spell father? And she said, because I've never had a father. You can't, this is the pain, isn't it?
Okay, so that's one aspect that kind of we'll say the victims or like I guess you becoming a victim because your son or a family member was killed or injured. I wanted to ask you, there's also, but by no means is the book just about women who kind of experience their own loss. Some of the stories are women who were combatants and who ended up, through their action causing others to lose lives. I was hoping you could go over the story of Mairead Farrell, her
Yes.
yeah, her like she herself is one of these exceptional women in that they took part in like the sharp end. I think it's fair to say that like a guerrilla army or an insurgency army or terrorist, whatever you want to call them, the role of a woman is much they have the capacity to be a lot more effective than it would be in a type of war where like World War II or like Russia Ukraine where it's kind of like a front line. The fact there's that analogy about a guerrilla soldier needing to be like a fish who could swim amongst the water. A woman, of course, will slip under the radar of a lot of people just given that you naturally associate violence and terrorism and stuff with men.
I knew that, or I suspected that, when I included people like Mairead Farrell in the book, that people would say, well, why is he including someone like Mairead Farrell, who was a combatant? But I won't look at women generally. I mean, Mairead Farrell could have been other things. I mean, the backdrop of her own experiences in many ways drove her, like a lot of other young people on both sides, into the arms of paramilitaries and they became part of the war, and that happens in all conflicts. Mairead Farrell really was a young girl who loved Irish dancing, had a sort of a loving attachment to life and to her family. But the thing is that, she was sitting around with other kids in the Falls Road watching the war unfold. And the British Army was fairly brutal at that stage. I mean, I was a reporter. I remember covering some of the riots and then some of the ways in which the army snatch squads pulled young people off the streets and beat them. I was there in the Lower Falls curfew when they fired, 1,000 or more canisters of CS gas into tiny streets where elderly people and babies were living and mothers. So, a lot of the kids ended up sort of seeing the army as their enemy. Well, Mairead Farrell is one of those kids who got caught up throwing stones. And she graduated from throwing stones to becoming a member of Cummanamon, which is the female wing of the IRA. And the IRA had this female wing, which didn't have a parallel within loyalism. In other words, the Protestant paramilitaries, unlike the sort of Catholic paramilitaries, didn't have a sort of a separate unit or separate line of command, which was purely female. But the IRA had this historically. And really, these women were marginalized. I mean, the kind of roles they undertook in that early stage was hiding weapons, carrying weapons from one place to another, doing surveillance. But they were also trained in bomb making and other things. And they were sent to camps across the border in Donegal in the west and down in Kerry and down in Wexford too. I mean, to learn how to be really good operators. Mairead Farrell, I mean, it gives you an example of what she was like. I mean, she goes on her first bombing run to bomb a hotel and she wears her disco shoes, right? Can you imagine? And she asked for the biggest gun, which was a 45 caliber weapon. It's like she's like Bonnie and Clyde, her and the two guys she was with. And one of them was her young lover. And the thing is that when the police arrive at the site where the bombs are been planted in the hotel, they have to scarper this trio, and she finds that she can't run in her disco shoes, so she hides in bushes, and is discovered there by a policeman, and her young lover is killed in the operation. So, you know, that was a that drove and instilled in her this sense of impending disaster. So for the rest of her life, her short life, she always felt that she was going to die young. She realized that the policeman, had he been a member of the SAS, would have, shot her dead, but he didn't. The cop just arrested her. But she still felt that her death had been that close. So she ends up in Armagh prison, and she's so bright that she becomes the female commander in the IRA wing at Armagh prison. And she leads a dirty protest, and she leads a hunger strike. And in her hunger strike, she almost dies. But if you notice, there's very little in that whole history about the women in Armagh prison who were on their own dirty press protest or on the hunger strike. Why? Because women were kind of marginalized. This was a misogynistic organization, but the guys in the maze, like who were the big names that come out of the hunger strike, they got all the publicity. But eventually, when she's released, her friends say to her, "Look, Mairead, you've done your bit. Just start going to discos. You love dancing and whatever, and forget about the war." Well, she didn't. She ended up in Sinn Féin headquarters in West Belfast, talking to foreign journalists. And before long, she's been sent to bomb Gibraltar. Well, at least on her recce to bomb it, because we don't know if she would have eventually been part of the bomb team when it would have been taken into Gibraltar. So this is Mairead Farrell. And I thought to myself, and I think someone said in the New York Times after her death, she could have been so many other things. And this is why I included her in the book, because she was symptomatic or illustrative of a lot of other young girls who got caught up in the violence, Price sisters as well. And they got caught up because that was the nature of the war. And a lot of young men on both sides who normally would have led different kinds of lives were in the middle of a conflict and were vulnerable to all the influences and all the things that were happening.
I'll ask you in a second. You pointed out rightfully in the book that okay, obviously the Gibraltar killings were in '88. She was only out of prison in '86, and obviously because she was in prison, her face would have been known, and they would have had files on her and all that. So it's quite kind of kind of fishy in a way that they sent her. I'll ask it in a minute. Can you first preface that by just giving us like a brief overview of kind of what happened in Gibraltar and the nature of the killings, the kind of you could argue like executions as opposed to anything else.
The one thing about the Gibraltar operation, a team were sent to Gibraltar, and it wasn't, you had the team of three, which was sort of Savage, Daniel McCann, and Mairead Farrell. And you had other people who were there in Torremolinos, and there was a bomb that was constructed, and it was in a car in a garage in Torremolinos. But the point really that is striking about this, and senior IRA figures pointed it out to me, how could an organization that was so effective send three people who were high list targets for surveillance by British military intelligence, by MI5, by Special Branch, and by MI6. And their files are also available to European intelligence services. To send them on flights out of Dublin to Spain. I mean, one of the things that always happened with the intelligence community was that they had lists of people and they knew mostly where they were at any given time. And if they disappeared from their usual haunts, then the sort of red light began flickering, and there was an order: find them wherever they are, because if they're not here, they're up to no good. And so that would have been the case with this group going to Gibraltar, except that the IRA was so heavily penetrated in Belfast with people like Scapitici in its ranks, steak knife, but he was only one of many, that the operation was never going to be tight. I mean, Brendan Hughes said to me he didn't really want to go from Dublin at one stage to Belfast because he said Belfast was so corrupted and so dangerous even for him, because he suspected some of his compatriots of being dirty, and he was scared to get in there in case he might get hit himself. Right. So they get to Gibraltar. I mean, they go from Torremolinos to go to Gibraltar. They drive into Gibraltar to see where they can eventually park a car with a bomb in it, not far from the governor's housing place, right, where they very often had a band and people came to hear the band on Sunday afternoon. But the thing is that Thatcher already knew. I mean, Thatcher didn't take any prisoners. Margaret's attitude was, if you're going to hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. I mean, just look at look what you did to the Argentinians, okay, the Falklands. I mean, she just went for them. I mean, in a really big way and very, very decisively. And she did the same with the INLA in the early 70s when they killed her best friend, Ari Neve. She made it clear
the late 70s, you mean?
Yeah, they were, they were targets. In other words, that they could be hit, they could be taken out.
No, so you were sorry, you asserted in the book that Ronnie Bunting and No Little's killings were directly directly her orders as revenge, because it's believed that Ronnie Bunting sanctioned the tilt switch bomb that killed Erin Eve.
Yeah, that was a mercury tilt switch bomb that exploded under Mary Neve's car as he drove into the underground car park at Parliament Building. Thatcher was so angry about that. She was so angry when Captain Westmacott, the only SAS captain killed in the Troubles, was murdered by a group called the M60 Gang, led by a man who ends up in America at one stage in a jail in downtown Manhattan, right? And the one thing about Thatcher was Thatcher demanded the American government give him back. She was relentless about it. So when it came to Gibraltar, Thatcher when she learned that these people were going to go into Gibraltar and going to kill a lot of people, her attitude was the SAS are going to go in and take them out. Gibraltar was never going to be an arrest operation. It really wasn't. I mean, the one thing that struck me about it, I imagined in the book Mairead Farrell walking into Gibraltar on a Sunday morning with Daniel McCann, who's 6'1" and blonde, and the operation, Thatcher's operation, SAS operation in Gibraltar was called Flavius, and Flavius in Latin means blonde. So Thatcher knew exactly who they were targeting. And I imagined her walking down a street in Gibraltar with all those sort of British pubs, preparing the, roast beef and Yorkshire pudding for lunch, and with music playing, and maybe Whitney Houston about her song of that week in the charts about a lost love. Because who had lost a love in her first operation, Mairead Farrell. And I thought both women, one was addicted to cocaine that killed her, and Mairead Farrell was addicted to romantic republicanism and was about to kill her too. And so that when I looked at the whole sort of Gibraltar thing, it was a very, very brutal, right, takedown of the IRA team in Gibraltar. The SAS, I mean, riddled them. I mean, it riddled them close up, shot them in the face, shot them in the head, shot them in the body. There was no room for a mistake, and that was Thatcher.
And
So
some
you look at Farrell and you say, well, that girl, she was an Irish dancer. She could have had a different life if this war hadn't been there.
Okay, yeah. So some people in defending the actions of the SAS would offer like a few different reasons as to why they were shot as opposed to attempted arrest. What one of them, which has been discredited, was that they might have had a remote thing to trigger the bomb. Even if they were like you were trying to arrest them, they could still trigger the bomb. There was also, I mean, they could possibly be armed, but I believe they had eyes on them to the degree that the Brits would have known that they weren't, right?
Well, they knew the bomb was still in when this RA team was in Gibraltar about to be, let's say, assassinated, because it was assassination as such. The intelligence service knew the bomb was still in the car park in Torremolinos. The thing is, I believe the post shooting information was supplied to the media had been well prepared. I think it had already been prepared. But there were so many lies told afterwards, so much confusion. But the basic line was that, yeah, I mean, we thought, well, they might be carrying the switch right in their hand, one of them, and so that's why we had to take them out. Guess what? They were all carrying switches. They knew that there was no bomb in the car that went into Gibraltar. They'd watched them for 24 hours a day.
Okay, so another aspect of the Mairead Farrell being well known, but still having been sent on this very kind of risky, high profile job. What one view you could take on it is that maybe she was sent by higher up IRA as like a way of kind of sacrificing her, much in the same way that some would believe that a similar thing happened with Lochgall, where they were betrayed from above and then set up just to get slaughtered. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not dealing with local, but I can deal with Gibraltar. I mean, senior IRA figures that I talked to about Gibraltar were just mesmerized by the failure of the IRA to realize we're sending these people off who were so well known for this kind of operation. But what was much more striking than that was that Farrell didn't really want to go. And I was told that McCann didn't want to go. But you've got to remember about McCann, and this is one of the critical elements of this whole story. McCann, at one stage, he was young. He was kind of well liked, but he was a serious operator. He killed policemen. He, in many ways, he was the defining, I think, figure in that operation, because he'd been on the brigade staff in Belfast. That was a very senior role. But he fell out with the powers that be, and I'm talking about the McGuinness and other people, faction, as you might call it, because he didn't see the way forward the way Gerry Adams saw the way forward, the way McGuinness saw the way forward, and eventually he's kicked off the brigade staff. So once he's kicked off the brigade staff, I mean, do you send this guy who's that well known? Because British intelligence would have known he was on the brigade staff. You send him to Gibraltar. So why? Was it just convenient that they were wiped out? I mean, the information was leaked. You've got to. I don't know, and I can't say definitively why it was leaked. I can't say definitively why those who leaked it did so. Did they want to get rid of a problem they had within the IRA at that time, which was defined by McCann? um, more so even than Farrell. So that is part of the story. And of course, McGuinness then is under so much pressure when their bodies are brought back and they're sort of suddenly, suddenly made heroes. He says, I'm going to have an inquiry to find out why this operation was compromised. And who does he put on the inquiry board to provide an answer to that? He puts Scappaticci. So you're putting the wolf in the henhouse, right? So nobody ever saw anything from McGuinness about why it had been compromised. Nobody knows. I've spoken to people who should have known if McGuinness had been honest about it, and they saw nothing from McGuinness about why the operation was compromised. You have to ask yourself. I mean, Scappaticci, when it's clear that he's dirty, he leaves and then comes back and has a meeting, I'm told, with very senior IRA figures, and they knew what this guy had been up to, and it was in the media that he was steak knife and all the rest of it. And he makes it clear to them, there's a lot of dirt here, and everybody's going to have to take the hit if you want to hit me. So there's kind of an answer in an indirect way that I'm giving you to, if I can, to that issue.
No, I see. Very good. Okay, so for those we won't go into all of them, but for those who don't know, Gibraltar began this like trifecta of like these kind of disastrous events that ended up in, I think, unnecessary deaths. The second being at the funeral of the three from Gibraltar. There was Michael Stone started throwing grenades and shooting in an attempt to kill Jerry Adams, and then at the funeral at one of the people killed at that attack, the two
The two young soldiers are dragged from the
yeah.
car and killed remorselessly. I mean, by the way, those two young soldiers, I discovered, I talked to one of the families later in England, and that family was put under pressure not to ask too many questions because the army sort of said those soldiers, one of them took the other out, to just see what was going on in West Belfast following the burial of the Gibraltar Three and the attack on the cemetery, the cortege and the people there, including Adams, by Michael Stone. And so, as you say, there was a funeral of one of the people shot by Stone. And at that funeral, these two young soldiers are dragged from the car. Now, the story was, according to the army, of course, that one soldier took the other in just to show them what was going on. I discovered they were both intelligence operatives. They were actually living in East Belfast.
Oh, really?
And they had been abroad under training, and they were living there under the army anyway, under the usual sort of cover of sort of technicians, but really they were operatives. And their families didn't really know the background. And the sad thing is that when one of the families begins to ask too many questions, the answer is, if you ask too many questions, we will blame your son for taking his buddy in there and having him killed because of his stupidity. So the family backed off because I wanted to interview the family for Sky News at the time I was living in Buckinghamshire, and I knew about those soldiers and why they were in West Belfast. They were in West Belfast because the intelligence community knew a lot of very senior people would be coming up from Dublin for the funeral. And they had certain people in mind that they wanted to target, to observe, right? And they wanted to know where they were and who was coming into Belfast. So that's why they were in the car. But they made a mistake by turning around and turning into the cortege. And so they were dragged from the car and almost, beaten to death and shot.
I was going to say, yeah, no matter, I mean, no matter what you think of the security force or kind of how bad they are, I think it's quite obvious it was an accident. Whatever they were up to, it was an accident that they drove into it. They wouldn't have done it on purpose. And
They weren't there to kill anybody that day, though. And the thing about it shows you how kind of immature they were. Had those been SAS figures there in that car that day, they'd have just opened up and killed an awful lot of people. They wouldn't have been taken at all. Had they been SAS. Those guys weren't trained for that kind of thing. They were trained as kind of operatives involved in surveillance, and that's what they're doing in Belfast. I mean, the UDA leader in Belfast at the time, Brad Nelson, who was also an army intelligence operative, who was running the UDA's killing squads against Republicans. He knew they were in East Belfast. He knew where they were. And a source of mine, right, is interviewing someone, right, who's a common criminal. And the common criminal says to him, look, I tell you what, if you let me go, I can tell you about two soldiers who are living in my neighborhood, undercover. And it was those two soldiers.
In defense, like obviously, if anyone has seen the footage, it's on YouTube. It's very kind of disturbing and
Oh, it's ghastly. It was a ghastly double murder. It really was.
it was yeah, obviously
Hard to watch. It's really hard to watch. I've watched it once or twice, and that's it. I couldn't. I only watched it for informational purposes.
yeah. I was gonna say it's a tough watch. In fairness, now, right? In defense of the crowd, they were at the funeral of someone who was killed by a loyalist at a different funeral. So of course
It was paranoia.
their instant thought was we're being attacked again, and this is another Michael Stone. So in fairness, now I would understand them tearing two people limb from limb if they
Oh,
thought that's what was going on, you know?
I would agree that there was paranoia after the cemetery attack, that this was another loyalist attack. But what you cannot do is you cannot move from that position that they're dragged away from there and they're taken somewhere else and still being beaten and then executed. I mean, because then I mean, if the IRA wanted, they could have taken them away and discovered, though, they weren't Michael Stone. They were soldiers. I mean, they were talking. They were in English accents. The IRA was brutal that day. I mean, it really was. I mean, you know, you can't. There's no excuse. I mean, fair enough. The crowd thought it was under attack, and so that's why they dragged it from the car. But the crowd didn't take them away and execute them the way they were executed, stripped almost. I mean, that was awful. It was ghastly stuff.
I agree. I agree. Okay, let us move on. Another chapter in your book. It actually covered two very prolific women from the Troubles, and they've gotten a lot more publicity now that Say Nothing as a book was such a big hit, and then the TV series. These, of course, I'm referring to. Well, the Price sisters. There's two of them, but we're talking about Dolores, and of course Jean McConville. Yeah. Can you give us like an overview, the overview that you would give to someone who is new on the subject about Jean McConville's execution?
Well, my overview would be that most people now kind of know because of the Disney series on a book called Say Nothing, would know about the book, and it was written by an American called Patrick Radden Keefe. And it's about essentially the centerpiece is the killing of a poor mother called Jean McConville. Now, when that book came out, I mean, I was very angry, and so was my colleague Ed Maloney, because of the way in which our material, our previous writings had been used within the book. I mean, this book had a 67-page index. No book I've ever come across about the Troubles has a 67-page index. You know, the only book, as I said to someone who might have that, would be if you were writing the Lost Chronicles of Cassiodorus. Because even when I went through it to see what had been taken from previous works of mine, like A Dirty War, Stone Cold, God and the Gun, Political Murder, etc., etc., I didn't know where to place them in this book, Say Nothing, and what he had used, because he had mined so much stuff in a way, you know, from the past, from other writings. Now, the one thing about his account, and I saw some stuff recently in the American media, he has said, well, you know, the one thing about Saying Nothing, and is that he said, I solved the mystery of the death of Jean McConville because he said he knew who actually shot her. And so he named someone I'm not going to name because I can't. And I'm not going to name someone if I don't have sufficient evidence to name that person. He feels he does, and I don't know why. I mean, really, he should have said nothing, because in the book he doesn't justify how he came about evidence to make it clear the person he said was the shooter was the actual shooter. Now, let me explain this. Jean McConville is one of the people I talked about in the Dirty War, being abducted, interrogated by the IRA, and then their bodies buried secretly. And I called it in the Dirty War a chapter, Secret Burials. Jean is a woman living in Divis Flats. Her husband has died. She's a bunch of kids. She doesn't have very much money. And she doesn't really want to be a part of the whole Troubles thing. Now, the thing is, when you're living in a place like that, you can't really stand off it as far as some people are concerned. And I think people ran interference against her who were women who were connected, either connected or very committed sort of Republicans who didn't sort of like this woman, had heard there was some kind of Protestant connection in her family. And her husband had once been in the British Army, her late husband. But she was just a poor woman and had to leave a Protestant area and go to Divis Flats for safety. She goes to Divis Flats for safety, and what is she's probably in the most danger in all her life. So the thing about Jean is that Jean is abducted and interrogated, and eventually she is put in a grave in a lonely strand in the Irish Republic. And there are three people standing over her because she's going to be executed, because the IRA believes that she's a spy, that she's been spying for the British Army. I don't think there's any credible evidence that she was a spy, but it's still possible to conclude that she might have been giving information to the British Army. We don't know. We don't know for certain, and that's why I can't say for certain that Jean McConville was an informant. But certain people in the IRA that I knew believed she was. They even believed that she had some kind of special transmitter. That was never found. And if the IRA had believed that, why didn't they produce it? Which they never did. So Jean's about to be shot and buried secretly. And there are three people standing over her. One of them is Dolores Price. Another one's a man called McClure, who operated with, the Price sisters in a group called the Unknowns within the IRA. Well, the Unknowns means very, interesting title, but they weren't really unknown. So I heard the three people all fired a shot at Jean McConville so that not one of them could say, well, he or she was the person who killed him. So there were two people I can name at that graveside. There's one I can't, who's a female. So Keith, on the other hand, in his book, Say Nothing and Disney, he says, right, there's one person at that, he mentions the people I mentioned, Dolores Price and McClure, and he mentions this other woman and says she was the shooter. And he offers a kind of convoluted reason for him knowing that, which doesn't make any sense to me. It's in the book. What he didn't know was that there were three other people watching this execution. There were three grave diggers. Keith didn't know anything about that. He didn't know that one of them, and this is the story that's in my book, right? He didn't know that one of them was a Garda informant. And that informant is later exposed by the IRA as being dirty, right? As an agent of the Garda in the Irish Republic.
Sorry to cut in. This is one of the grave diggers, not one of the three who...
That's one of the grave diggers, right? Okay. So these other three people that Keith didn't know about her watching the execution of this poor woman, right? One of those grave diggers is a Garda informant. When he's exposed as an informant, the IRA tradition is to shoot informants dead, to execute them, right? For treachery. But his father was a senior IRA figure, so obviously he bargains for his son's life, and the guy is allowed to pack up, go to America to make a new life. Now, I don't know whether that informant, that gravedigger informant, told his intelligence handler or handlers in the Garda that he was at the graveside when Jean McConville was murdered. Because that would mean, if he did, that they hid for decades where her body was buried and also who was involved. Because the thing is that a lot of handlers, if you ever talk to them in the intelligence services, they will tell you that agents are not always very reliable people. And very often they will hide some of the stuff or some of the nonsense they're involved in, some of the dirty stuff they're involved in, because they don't want to tell you everything. So maybe this guy never told the Garda. And that's why the grave wasn't discovered for decades. But the interesting thing for me is this, that Keith, if you're going to write a book like Say Nothing and you're going to put it on Disney, then get it right, okay? We're talking about history here. We're talking about exactitude, really. So therefore, he should have got it right, and I don't think he did. The other thing is this, that I asked, and I've had no answer to this, what forensic evidence was taken out of that grave that Jean McConville was buried in? Were there any sort of, let's say, bullet casings? Because remember, if you've got three people shooting, there might be bullet casings there anyway. Okay. Were there any bullet casings in the remains? So the people who were responsible for digging up her remains That was in the Irish Republic. That was the Garda. That was their territory. So they've had nothing really to say about this. So I don't know. It was America, the first thing that people be saying because they're watching all these crime shows all the time. Well, tell me about the forensics. What did you find? We don't know if anything was found. Okay. So that's what I have to say about, say nothing. It's well, it's well titled.
Did you watch the television series?
I mean, funny enough, I don't really want to talk about it because one of the things I don't really want to get into, I mean, I don't want to get into this dispute that he's having legally, right? Or Disney's having legally,
With
over because
Mairead Farrell?
he's saying there was one shooter and he knows exactly who this person was. Well, let's see the evidence. Let's find out.
Okay, putting aside putting aside the part about like Jean McConville's murder and the exact details, like the show generally, just as someone who lived through the time and who was actually there and who knows what an authentic 1970s and 1980s Belfast looks like and how people up there actually talk and act and so on. What level of what grade would you give the show in terms of all?
I'm not going to grade. Personally, I'm not going to grade it when I find that, I mean, the core of this story has not been told. So, I mean, I'm not going to grade it. That's up to other people to grade it because they like it or don't like it.
Even
My attitude really is very, very simple. Keith did not solve this mystery, and there's still material here, right, to be unearthed. I mean, we still have three people who were there. There's still three people who are watching this execution, and the guard have nothing to say about that. Now there's the Irish government having on their territory. So look, I mean, I don't want to get into the whole sort of. I think it's kind of silly about saying nothing. What was it? Disney's going to have its own problems dealing with this, and I've said what I need to say about it. And the problem, I think, for Keith is that he should have done due diligence when he looked at this, because I did, and I've told people that there are three other witnesses to this execution of this poor woman, and also, I think that it's very wrong if you're dealing with a major episode like this in the Troubles to say, well, look, now the mystery is solved, that's it, and here was the executioner. There's always going to be a lot more to it if he'd done enough groundwork on it. Okay.
fair enough. Okay, look, if you don't want to comment on my next question, that's fine. But given that you met, we'll say like post IRA involvement Brendan Hughes, and given that Brendan Hughes was portrayed both by Anthony Boyle as a young man and Tom Vaughan Lawler as an older man, but both excellent performances in my opinion. Did the Tom Vaughan Lawler did Tom Vaughan Lawler get the Brendan Hughes that you would have met and spoken to? Did he get that right? Did he?
I don't know. I mean, look, I can only talk about what I know about Brendan Hughes. So I never talk about what other people think or thought of him at any time in his
I'm
life.
talking about his portrayal, like as an
Well,
actor.
I mean, yeah, but I mean, look, John, my perspective is very simple. If I'm asked about Hughes, I will talk about Hughes and talk about what I know about Hughes. I'm not interested in sort of a commentary on other people's writings about Hughes. It's never a very good idea as a writer to sort of start dissecting the opinions of other writers. Other writers can say whatever they like.
That's not what I'm asking. Like I'm asking if like the act.
Well, ask me and then ask me a question. I mean, what is in particular you think that I should be commenting on someone else has written about Hughes? Is there something that strikes you as an issue that I should address?
It's not even an issue. It's just that you've
Well,
met.
okay. Well, then if it's
Like,
not an issue, then what is it? I mean, what is it you're asking me to do? I mean,
let
I'm
me
willing to talk to you. I'm willing to talk to you
ask
about Brendan Hughes and what I know about Brendan Hughes, and explain what I discussed with him in some detail, and what he had to tell me and what he didn't tell me about the disappeared because of his own involvement. And that's it. I mean, we're talking about this book, and I'm not dealing with what other people think about Brendan Hughes.
Fair enough. Again, even for the audience to make it clear what my question is, I'm not asking you to comment on any writing or any opinions. Given that you've met Brendan Hughes, and I haven't, and most of the listeners haven't. You're in a position to say like whether the actor's portrayal, I'm not talking about writing, I'm talking about the actor's portrayal of him was good, bad, in between. I'm just wondering
What do
about
you mean? Yeah, what do
because
you
I've
mean the active
spoken to
portrayal?
because I've
What do you mean the
spoken
active
to
portrayal of him? How do you think he was portrayed?
I never met the guy, so I can't
No, but I
comment
mean,
on
you don't
whether
get, you
how
obviously have an
actor.
opinion, but you obviously are aware of how he's portrayed. You wouldn't be asking this question. I mean, let's talk about Brendan Hughes if you like. I mean, Brendan Hughes was a major source for me. I never revealed that he was a source until after he died because that had been my agreement with him. I told him, I mean, I'll never break a trust. In terms of sources, I never will. It's the same with Enniskillen. People say to me, okay, let's have your sources. I've never done it, and I never will. Now, Brendan Hughes told me at a time in history when nobody else knew that the IRA was burying people secretly. The one thing I later discovered is that he never told me that he was involved when Jean McConville was being interrogated before she was secretly buried. He never told me he was involved in the interrogation of Joe Linsky and led the investigation of Linsky was an IRA operative before he was secretly buried, and his body still hasn't been recovered. So, and Linsky, of course, is found guilty of betraying IRA trust by being involved with the wife of an IRA man who's in prison, and then trying to sort of have that person executed. Um, and that's the kind of love triangle that was very nasty. Hughes also talked to me about other things. He talked to me about the bombing campaign in England. Hughes Hughes' attitude to me, I remember at the time, was, look, I'm going to tell you certain things to help you understand where we're coming from. But as he said to me, but if you publish them, he said, we'll kill you. And he said, I don't care where you are, we'll find you. So Hughes had this relationship with me, which was kind of rather quixotic, you know. In other words, he would tell me things which I could publish. And also, I can tell you this, I went looking to the IRA for the notes they had put in a dump of interrogations of people that the nutting squad, as it was called in West Belfast, kept on their victims. I wanted those notes because I wanted to discern what the IRA think that had learned from people that they were torturing and had shot, executed. And Hughes thought that the IRA should give me those notes. He really did. Hughes is getting to that stage in his life where he was disillusioned about the past. I mean, Hughes is the person I asked him what was it like to sort of kill someone. He said it was just like looking into a dark cupboard. Well, there's nothing in a dark cupboard, is there? And he ends up in Divis Flats. I mean, a very sad man. I I liked Hughes. He was very intelligent. British intelligence thought he was probably one of the best that the IRA had ever had as an intelligence chief. I mean, he was the man who really dealt with the MRF in the early 70s and helped expose the fact that they were running operations like the Four Square Laundry, where they were running a laundry service and picking up laundry in West Belfast and then forensically testing the laundry to find out if the people who give them this laundry to be cleaned at a really good price were actually operatives, were people dealing with explosives or weapons. So he's told me a lot of stuff. I mean, he told me about people he'd interrogated. And so what do I make of Hughes? What I think about Hughes is that he was someone who was a very dear friend of Gerry Adams at one stage in his life. He was a kind of figure who was admired within the IRA for his efficiency, for his ability to run a counterintelligence operation. Because as a result of Hughes' activities, a fair number of British agents were uncovered within the IRA and executed. So that's what I can say about Hughes. Other people have other opinions about Hughes and other experiences, but those are mine.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna do an episode with this ex-IRA man, but we ended up speaking about it. He didn't want his voice or face appearing on camera regarding it. But he was gonna talk to me about the acting job that Anthony Boyle and that Tom Vaughan Lawler did because he actually knew both. He knew young Brendan Hughes and he knew older one. He actually said just so people know, he said that Anthony Boyle did a fantastic job. He was very like true to character, and he said that the Tom Vaughan Lawler acting job of the older Hughes was also very good. just so the audience.
Hughes was a very likable guy. I mean, you don't come across people who Hughes was very sophisticated intellectually. He was very bright, and he was not deceptive. I mean, for instance, I mean, he withheld stuff from me, but that was his right. I discovered that later. But at the same time, he wanted me to know certain things that, as a writer, as a journalist, that I should know. And that's when I was writing the Dirty War. So in many ways, I got on very well with Hughes. I didn't have any problems with him that I had with some other people, on both sides who sort of wanted to put a bullet in me. So Hughes never threatened me.
That's nice. I was going to say, in that chapter, the one dealing with Dolores Price and Jim McConville, you expressed like a great degree of skepticism regarding what Dolores Price told Ed Maloney pertaining to her own involvement in McConville.
Sorry, I've never expressed any criticism of what Ed Maloney has written. I haven't.
No, 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 no. That's not what I said. Criticism of what Dolores Price told Ed
No,
Maloney.
what I said was, and some people are a bit angry about it, and I mean, they can be angry if they don't. Well, it's their right. What I said was that I felt at times that Dolores Price was telling a story in a very convenient way to sort of represent herself as someone who suddenly found God, as it were. I don't know. I mean, what I felt was at times was a bit self-serving because when you look at really what she told Ed, and Ed really is a source. I mean, if people really want to look at that whole Boston thing, I mean, Ed's an excellent investigator, one of the best. And Dolores kind of tries to downplay her role, and yet look at the way she treated this woman, Jean McConville, and said at one stage that, Jean was sort of being critical of the IRA. I mean, she never mentions anything about the fact that Jean had children. Jean wouldn't have walked away from her children. Everybody who knew anything about Jean McConville knew she cared so much about her kids. You mean that this woman was being taken somewhere and wasn't talking about her children and when she was going to see them and the money that the IRA was promising her? That even sort of suggested to her that, there was a special group of Legion of Mary people who were going to take her south of the border and protect her. I mean, it told her so many goddamn lies. So, Dolores in many ways doesn't give us let's say, the unexpurgated version, which must be fairly awful when you think about this poor woman being taken in this car and the fact that she'd been interrogated. And, she thinks that the Legion of Mary are taking her south of the border. And then she's criticizing the IRA. And Dolores is really angry about that. I mean, why? I mean, would anybody be sort of kind saying, thank the IRA for picking me up, interrogating me, slapping me around, and then putting me in this car to take me south of the border? Do you think she'd have said that to people she believed were Legion of Mary? Thank the IRA for me. So she didn't. I mean, she thought they were Legion of Mary, and she's saying, if she'd said anything at all about the IRA, should have been entitled to say it, for God's sake. So if I said that I thought that Dolores didn't give us the clean version, she didn't, because it must have been fairly awful for that woman driving her south of the border in that particular night. I'll not say any more about it. It's very disturbing.
Fair enough. I won't keep you too much longer. Another.
Yeah, because I have to go, John. Anyway.
Yeah, could I like another 5 minutes? There was just
okay, sure.
I was just hoping. One of the chapters in the book dealt with a young lady named Tracy Doak, who joined the RUC and was killed by a roadside bomb. Just given that we've spoken about women who were paramilitaries, I figured we balance it out a little at the end.
Oh, Tracy Doak. I mean, I had her photograph on my desk. Because I was talking to her mother, and her father had been a policeman himself, and she sent me sort of photographs of Tracy. She's a beautiful girl. I was saying to someone, it's like, detectives. You see them in movies, and they're trying to sort of, for a family, they're trying to find the perpetrators of someone who killed their father, mother, or whatever. And the detective always has a photograph there to remind him of who he's dealing with. I mean, I had photographs here in my desk, and one of the photographs was of Tracy Doak. And this young girl was an Irish dancer. Her mother, they were Protestants, right? They ran an Irish dance. Her mother ran an Irish dancing group in the Northwest. And the thing is that she always wanted to be, I suppose maybe because her father was a policeman, people follow in their parents' footsteps. She wanted to become a cop, and she was very, very bright. She was one of the brightest of her time, and she was really going places. But she ends up in, when she eventually graduates, she ends up in Uri. That's a very, very difficult place to be because there's the edge of one of the most dangerous areas in Northern Ireland at that time, with the South Armagh Brigade that really was probably more lethal than any other grouping, IRA grouping in Northern Ireland. They bombed, of course, Newry police station. She established she lost a friend in that bombing. But the day she dies, she's in a car with her just newly sort of appointed boss and two other young cops like herself, they're kind of rookies. And in a car at the border meeting a Brinksmat van coming up from Dublin with a lot of money. And there's a roadside bomb waiting for her. And she's blown to bits. The only thing that identified her was her ring that she had on her finger. And her mother had her bedroom all those years, even after her death, was still the same, kept almost as kind of shrine to her. She was an amazing young girl. She didn't have any, there was no political dimension to her at all. She just wanted to be a cop. And her father actually was a very good cop too. I mean, the family were very sort of conservative. And I mean conservative in a very proper sense. And they were liked by their neighbors. And so Tracy was going places, and she just ends up being blown to bits. And that's on a stretch of border road there at Killeen, where a lot of people died, a lot of bombs along that stretch, where people were killed. And I think when you talk about collusion, there was collusion south of the border with the IRA. I mean, there's certain guarded people who turned a blind eye to what the South Armagh Brigade and others were doing in that region of Northern Ireland. So when you talk about collusion, let's keep it right that it didn't just happen in Northern Ireland.
Interesting, yeah, of course.
I mean, you even have a situation, and I mean, I'm sorry to just interrupt, John, but you even have a situation where a young girl loses her eye in a bombing in Dublin. It's Talbot Street, and for years it's called the accident, and all the victims of that, right? The families of the victims of it, they called it the accident. Why did it called the accident? As if, I mean, this was an accident, like a sort of, bus accident or a car accident.
Sorry, you might
This was loyalists blowing up people in the centre of Dublin. And the Irish government didn't say to people, stop calling it the accident. The Irish government just didn't want the truth about the level of loyalist violence that was being brought into their capital city.
For anyone who hasn't read the book, you might provide some context on this the accident thing, because I don't think people will know if they haven't read the book.
I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard, John, that someone had called that bombing in Dublin at that time as the accident. And when I started, when I started investigating this, and I've talked to the girl. She lost her eye, and it changed her life in many ways. She's a wonderful, wonderful, courageous human being. And she said to me, "Well, the accident." And I said, "Excuse me, what do you mean the accident?" She said, "Well, the bombing where people were killed and said I was injured. That's the accident." And I said, "Who told you it was the accident?" She said, "Well, we all called it the accident. Her lawyer called it the accident." And when I talked recently, when I was down promoting the book in Dublin in the past week, people couldn't get over this. That was allowed to be, they had to be perpetuated as a myth that this was an accident. So people should read the book; they'll find out what I have to say about it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now for all your time, the book is The Sorrow and the Loss. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It consists of about, I think, like around 15 or 16 chapters, each with a different person. We only spoke about a small handful. There's way more. There's way more in the book. And if you've liked this interview, then I'm sure you like the book. We'll put a link in the description. Anything else you wanted to mention?
No, it's good to talk to you. I mean, one of the things, John, I hope, I mean, when the book is promoted in America in the next month or so, that people here will read it, because I think a lot of things like that in this book that people don't know about the Troubles. They don't know about the role of women. It was kind of lost in all the coverage over the time, over those decades. So it'll be nice to see people understand for all these chapters the different types of women, what they were doing during this conflict. I mean, how they felt. I mean, how they felt even decades later the answers they still haven't been given. So hopefully, I mean that will come across in the United States too, where people, can maybe learn a bit more about the past.
Sorry, no, I know I said last thing, but you just reminded me. There's a famous photo of a young lady with some kind of an assault rifle, and she's standing kind of against the wall, and her face is covered by her hair. It's like kind of it's one of the more famous photos kind of from the Troubles. Do you know the one I'm referring to?
I think I know the one. Yeah.
I only asked because I've heard later that it was staged, that it wasn't.
Well, I would say probably yes. I mean, the RA was really good at that at the time too. That was part of that was part of the kind of propaganda war. Okay, that's the kind of thing that happens. So yes, I know the photograph you're talking about. I think it probably was staged.
Very good. Thank you very much now for the interview. I'd love to go back and read some of your books that I haven't, and do more. Speak with you again sometime if you'll be
Yeah,
up.
you should read the Trigger Man sometime, or even God McGon. But yeah, I mean, Joe, it's nice to talk to you.